Great. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Welcome on behalf of the European Liberal Forum, the political foundation and think tank of the European Liberal Party, the ALDE. This is the third webinar organized by the European Liberal Forum with the support of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, We Are Innovation, and GPS, the group of producing countries from the Southern Cone. Negotiations on the free trade agreement between the EU and the Mercosur nations of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay has taken more than 20 years. The initial agreement on the FTA was reached in 2019, and this FTA would establish the largest free trade area that the EU has ever created, covering a population of over 780 million. However, for the past years, the FTA is already strongly contested, mainly because of environmental and climate concerns. So we continue this series on the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. The last one in September, we focused on the issue of food security, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. Today, continuing the discussion, we will see how free trade can go hand in hand with protecting the environment. And we couldn't find a better timing for this, since we are in the middle of the 27th conference of the parties of the UN climate change conference, which is meeting in Egypt. And it's also seeking to tackle global challenges of climate change. In this context, it is important to make liberal solutions heard, how to improve access to innovations across the world through free trade, how to improve investment and access as incentives to adopt more stringent environmental standards, the so-called EU normative power that we're so proud of, and so on. And in this context, we see the EU-Mercosur agreement as a tool to stimulate the use of better, cleaner production processes, better and more functional decision-making, environmental policies, and technologies. So without further ado, and looking forward to a very interesting discussion from our distinguished speakers that I would like to thank beforehand, I'm giving the floor to Dr. Maria Garcia from the University of Bath, who will moderate today's webinar. Thank you very much from me, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Antonios, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon to discuss such an interesting and important topic. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce and listen to our wonderful expert speakers today. So I'll just quickly introduce both of our speakers and pass on the floor to them. So today we're going to be hearing about how to use the EU-Mercosur trade agreement if it can be used as a tool for enhancing the environment and environmental policies. And we'll hear from Kai Weiss, who is the Research and Outreach Coordinator of the Austrian Economic Center, as well as a board member at the Friedrich August von Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria. He is the co-editor of Green Market Revolution, which was published in 2020 and presents a pro-market alternative to protect the environment, and is a book that has already been read in over 90 countries to date. So Kai will speak first, and then our second speaker is Valeria Pinedo, who is the acting head for the Latin American region and senior research coordinator in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Her recent work includes modeling the impacts of agricultural support policies on emissions from agriculture and reviewing the evidence on incentives for the adoption of sustainable agricultural practices. Her work in Latin America and the Caribbean region includes development strategies and economic growth, trade policies, the effects of economic downturns, migration, and tax policies to reduce obesity. Valeria received her PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Maryland, and she is a member of the GPS network. I think we're in for a real treat this afternoon with these two fantastic experts on the linkages between trade, environment, agricultural production. So I really look forward to learning a lot from them. So Kai, if you'd like to take the floor whenever you're ready.
Sure, thanks so much, and thanks for having me today. I wanted to just go the next few minutes to kind of give a more perhaps theoretical basis of why free trade is extremely important when it comes to protecting the environment. And I'm kind of basing this on something called the Market Environmentalism Declaration that a friend of mine and we co-authored last year, and to which a little more than people from over 130 organizations from around the world and all continents signed up and supported. So kind of just going through the arguments of that and trying to show how free trade fits into that picture. So what we basically say is that obviously I think we can all agree that climate change poses extreme environmental, economic, social risks, and that there's also just an intrinsic value in protecting our landscapes, ecosystems, oceans, and wildlife that is worth protecting. But the essential question is always, how do we do that actually? And I think normally in environmental debates, certain form of environmental policy tends to win out and be the only one that is considered, namely one that is kind of top down by a centralized government kind of implementing different policies. And we would argue that that approach has been highly insufficient, perhaps even damaging to the environment, and also to other areas of our life, including the economy. And so I think we need to kind of get away from, like always, looking only at regulations, taxes, subsidies, and central planning as a means to protect the environment, and to rather embrace the market economy, where markets, free enterprise, trade, and communities create accountability and unleash innovation, which I think is the best approach to fully address climate change and resource use. So we kind of put up 4 different areas or 4 different aspects of that we think are extremely important. First one is market economy, the second is private property rights, the third decentralization, and the fourth optimism and innovation. So market economy, I think the basic thing that we need to realize is that the economy and economic prosperity is not opposed to environmental success. We don't need to go back to kind of a hunter-gatherer society so that the environment is doing better. Rather, those 2 things, if done properly, can go hand in hand. We can have both economic success and environmental success. So while we often think of our world today having been based on a market approach, and so environmental damage and climate change is a sort of market failure, it seems more appropriate to think of the current approach as more of a crony approach, in which fossil fuel subsidies, energy monopolies, and regulatory capture have been the primary system that we've lived in. It has not been the market and entrepreneurs working things out. It has been very big corporations and big governments working hand in hand and getting a special deal for each other. Rather, if we kind of let the market if we leave it a little more room, we would argue the environment would do better as well, because as statistics show, the freer an economy is, the better its environmental outcomes are. So if you, for instance, compare on the one hand, the Environmental Performance Index from Yale University, which measures on different areas how healthy an environment in a country is. If you measure that with the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, which measures how free an economy is, there's a very clear sign, which is the environment does better where there's more economic freedom. And where there's more economic freedom, there's also more economic growth. That goes hand in hand with something called the environmental Kuznets curve, which shows that as economies grow richer, they at some point there will be kind of a tipping point in which they will become so efficient and environmentally conscious that economic growth and pollution are gradually decoupled, as we have seen also in Western countries in many ways over the last decades. Only the market economy's dynamic nature incentivizes the entrepreneur to do more with less. That is all, the whole thing of, let's say, the profit motive is that you do more with less. You create more profit by using less resources. And the market economy, by opening up possibilities creates innovations that limit our ecological footprint. And free trade is crucial in that for both innovation and cooperation between people around the world, so that we can all jointly tackle environmental challenges. The second point, private property rights, is obviously the basis of it all. That has to be the basis of when we think of free trade and the environment, is private property rights. As Aristotle already said 2,500 years or whatever years ago, that which no one owns, no one cares for. And to take the other way around, that which someone owns, this person will also care for. Private property rights provide the incentives for both environmental sustainability and accountability, because ownership makes us more accountable. It makes us become stewards in a best case scenario, and makes us responsible. We want to have that property still being able to use it in the long-term future. We don't want to use it up immediately. And private property rights, when we talk about free trade, is needed to even trade resources that wouldn't be free trade if there wasn't private property. And it allows, in that sense, markets to reallocate natural resources for conservation purposes. So one thing, in that sense, what I mean with that, like free trade, that can be across borders, but also within. You can see, for instance, land being bought by environmental stewards, by people that care for the environment. They can buy land so that it can be preserved, as trusts, for instance, do, land trusts. The third point, decentralization, is probably the least applicable for this specific purpose of free trade. I'm just going to quickly go through it, which is that many environmental challenges are actually communal in nature. We always think of environmental problems as being this kind of thing that can only be solved globally. And I think in that sense, it might still be interesting to discuss this point in the wake of COP. We always think of environmental problems having to be solved globally, but a lot of the things can actually be solved on the ground in local communities, because they are better placed than governments to manage their shared resources. So one great example of that, that's more of a conservation topic, but I think there are ways to think of that on the climate change side as well. It's the work of the economist Ellen Ostrom, who's Nobel Prize economic laureate. And she, for instance, she always went to these different places, these different local communities, and she saw, hey, they can actually protect the environment as well. So let's take one example. She went to Switzerland, and she saw how land was owned, not privately, not by the government. It was used by the local communities, but it was not overused. Why? Because these local communities found different mechanisms within their community to solve these issues. They did that on their own, bottom up, through a long history, and it was part of the tradition. It was part of that community's dealing with each other. And it worked fantastically well, and it does to this day, and in so many ways. And I think we can see a lot of the problems with climate change being able to be fixed on the local level. So I come originally, I now live in the US, but I'm originally from Germany, very close to the Alps. And I can see there, whenever I'm there, that in all of these places, in all of these mountain towns, let's say, you have all of these initiatives that come from the people on the ground. You have all these initiatives to protect the environment, to make it better for tourists to be environmentally conscious. And I think there's a lot of potential there that decentralizing power from government bureaucracies to local communities fosters, in the end, closer cooperation and a better resource management and more accountability. The fourth point is optimism and innovation. So there seems to be a general nihilism, perhaps even, but also kind of the idea, this kind of misanthropic view that all we do is damage the environment. And we are sort of the enemies of the environment, and we are basically on the highway to climate hell or whatever. And obviously, there are massive challenges when it comes to climate change. But I think when we try to focus on bringing about innovations that can help the environment, we can also become more optimistic in the power of innovation to achieve real change. And we can see human beings not just as a plague on the planet, but rather as the ultimate resource, as Julian Simon put it, capable of bringing forth innovative ideas and solutions to protect our environment. And that focus on innovation and enabling that technological progress and entrepreneurship, through that we can reject alarmist approaches and embrace an approach in which we realize that these challenges exist, but that they can actually be resolved. And I think free trade in specifically can be a great boon in that. And so that's kind of the second major part that I want to talk about, is the role of free trade. Free trade, by breaking down barriers, can enable entrepreneurs, businesses to trade across borders. That is not only economically beneficial, which I think is pretty clear, but it can also be beneficial for the environment. So taking, for instance, just as one example, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, which was announced in 2019, it's called ACCTS in short, and it was signed by 5 countries, admittedly very small, initially by New Zealand, Iceland, Fiji, Costa Rica, and Norway. But I think it can show us how free trade could work when it comes to the environment, how clean free trade could work. There are 3 basic proposals in that agreement. The first one is the removal of tariffs and all kind of trade barriers when it comes to environmental goods and services. What are environmental goods and services? I think that's kind of the tricky issue here. But they used the definition by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which are activities which produce goods and services to measure, prevent, limit, minimize, or correct environmental damage to water, air, and soil, as well as problems related to waste, noise, and ecosystems. But in practice, this includes goods like solar panels, wind turbines, air quality monitors, and so forth. Like the list could be endless. But you would eliminate the tariffs and all the trade barriers when it comes to environmental concerns specifically, so as to free up the opportunity for environmental entrepreneurs to trade across borders in a much easier way and in a much more effective way. The second part is, that's extremely important, even though world leaders seem to usually be not very keen on that for very obvious reasons, is to eliminate all market distortions that exist. And there exist a lot of market distortions when it comes to the environment. And the biggest one are subsidies, especially fossil fuel subsidies. Every minute on this earth, per minute, $10 million are spent by governments around the world on fossil fuel subsidies. That, needless to say, distorts energy costs massively. If all of these fossil fuel subsidies would be abolished, it would reduce global carbon emissions by 20%, deaths by fossil fuel air pollution by over half, and it would save revenue equivalent to 4% of global GDP. It seems to be a pretty obvious argument to say, if we really care about the environment, as all world leaders tend to say, then that should be number 1 on the list, is to, obviously in a cautious manner so that it doesn't have massive economic and cultural costs, but in a way it would be extremely important to minimize the impact of fossil fuel subsidies and, as far as possible, eliminate them as soon as possible. That is also part of the ACCTS agreement. The third goal of the agreement is the development of voluntary guidelines for eco-labeling programs and mechanisms, so that consumers have more information about the environmental cost of products, because there's a universal set of standards across borders. And that, I think, is also important. It kind of leads to an important point, which is that we should also perhaps put a little more trust in consumers themselves, because the environment is kind of a top concern for most people. It is, in most Western countries, especially among young people, the primary concern overall. And it has led a lot of consumers to change their behavior. And it has led, through that force from the consumer side, it has led big corporations and businesses to adopt more environmentally friendly behavior. And so having a kind of eco-labeling program that is very similar and universalized across borders could help in that endeavor. Those are kind of the things that, let's say, ACCTS is trying to do. But I think, again, it goes a long way to show that free trade can be a great benefit for the environment, because I would argue, should stop always looking at ways to kind of constrain the economy by increasing barriers to be entrepreneurial, to do good for the environment, but rather through free trade, reduce the barriers, eliminate perhaps as far as possible even the barriers, get rid of the crony approach in which stuff like fossil fuel is just allowed to continue in this absolutely massive and astronomical way, and to thus kind of free up the possibilities for the people on the ground, for the entrepreneurs, for businesses to do a much better job. And obviously that will not get rid of all the problems, but I think it will improve the results a lot more than the general government failure of trying to protect the environment top down. I think the sort of pro-freedom approach in which freedom is expanded is much more preferable and much better to protect the environment.
Thank you very much, Kai. We'll go straight on to listen to Valeria Pinedo's presentation, but for the audience, please remember that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to start writing your questions at any moment, and we will get to them in the final section of today's discussion. Valeria, whenever you're ready.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are, I guess, in the world. I would like to share this. So can you see it well?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to share this with my colleagues from this panel. So the topic that I'm going to cover, I think that it really complements very well with Kai just mentioned. So I'm going to try to highlight some points that relates to trade and sustainability. And when I mean sustainability, it is really the bigger picture now of covering sustainability in terms of the environment, the social, and the economic. So as we all know, the challenge today is to really produce, not only produce more, but producing a diversified baskets of nutritious food in sufficient quantity, but also while trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also minimizing the impact on all natural resources. So not only emissions, but we're talking here about also water, land, etc. So to really accomplish all this, it will require a very integrated strategy that will take into account increase, again, productivity, environmental sustainability, food production systems, but also the efficient use of land, water, fertilizers, and energy. So trade can offer an effective solution to this challenge, since the endowments of natural resources available for sustainable food production presents large global imbalances. So with this, I would like to highlight some issues that it comes to my mind when we talk about trade and sustainability. So one is first the one concept that needs to be included at the time of analyzing sustainable production and diets and their promotion. So it is the inclusion of externalities that also Kai mentioned them earlier, that they are generated by the food system. And so here is not only the agricultural sector, but is the food system as a whole. So this true cost of food includes pollution of water and air, greenhouse gas emissions, overdrawn aquifers, biodiversity loss, land degradation, and of course, the rise of health illnesses related to the food consumption. So given all these externalities, it is really necessary to find the right incentives, both in the short term, but also in the long term. So from a scoping review that we did a couple of years ago, looking at 18,000 articles, one of the things we found was that the incentives that make the adoption of sustainable practices attractive depend heavily on the enabling economic and financial environment, and should account for trade-offs between economic and environmental outcomes. And this is the key word, is trade-offs. You can have both at the same time increasing, and there's always some kind of trade-off between the two objectives. So the policy environment around the food systems has a large influence on the nexus, again, between trade, climate change, production, and nutrition, through 4 drivers that I call how much we produce, what we produce, how we produce, and where it is produced. So again, this goes into what Kai also mentioned on the innovation and technologies. So agricultural trade in particular allows the world to take advantage of countries' heterogeneity. So one country has more land than other ones, and between this trade, we can really maximize and have a more efficient way of producing if we look at sustainability in terms of the environment. So what I want to highlight here in this figure on the graphs on the right is the share in global trade measured in value, but also in calories, and of course the emissions. And the differences between 2008 and 2010, using of course that FAO stats data and some calculations that we did at IFRU, my colleague David Laborde. So you can see that there is some kind of pattern between the two in terms of course, that if you increase production, you increase emissions, but it has to be those shares, do they go together or they are different? And here what we can see is that we really should be keeping an eye on lower middle income, because that relationship is off compared to developed or upper middle income countries. And again, we go into the what are the right incentives, what are the right policies that would allow these countries to develop, but developing also taking into consideration all the good technologies that will help us produce more, but reduce the emissions from the sector. And then just like also to highlight what we see today in terms of food access and availability. So as we can see, we know global markets have grown at a higher speed than domestic production, and to address these gaps between local demand and supply, trade of course comes into the picture. So this figure, what it wants to show is that if we look beyond calories, which is the figure on the left, we can see net imports and food consumption of proteins, highlighting the fact that for some countries, trade becomes crucial, not only for the quantity of food needed for domestic consumption, but also for the access and availability of proteins and nutrients in their diets. And then the figure on the right, what it shows is the number of food groups with insufficient local production to achieve a healthy diet by country, adjusted by food loss and waste. So the countries in the darker color represent a higher number of food groups with insufficient local productions to achieve a healthy diet. So for example, Argentina has a low level of insufficiency, while Madagascar has actually not. So it is really high insufficient in their production, local production. So we can see that food trade, with the implementation of the right local policies to properly address natural resources management, like forest protection laws, is an efficient way to give a greater sustainability to global food production. And of course, that a fair and transparent international food trading system not only has the potential to ensure global food security, but can also reduce the environmental impact of global food systems. So if we look at, give you some numbers. So the scope of trade agreements is also evolving to include environmental provisions. So between 1957 and 2019, out of 318 agreements that were concluded, 131 included at least one environmental related provision, and 71 of those agreements incorporating provisions that display the interaction between the environment and agricultural specifically. So such agreements provide incentives to producers to adopt sustainable practices to gain and maintain access to these markets. The other incentive that also Kai mentioned previously is the private and public environmental standards. And here I would like to bring in more now into the multilateral part of this topic. So as a general clause, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, members are free to adopt environmental policies. Such environmental requirements and taxes at the level they choose, even if they significantly restrict trade, as long as they do not introduce unjustifiable or arbitrary discrimination or disguise protectionism as an excuse to protect domestic producers. So it has been clarified by environmental related disputes at the WTO the environmental trade-related measures have to be, and there are 4 things that they need to be. I'm going to read it. So there have to be 1, coherent, 2, fit for purpose, 3, mindful and holistic, and the last one is flexible in order to reduce distortionary effects of non-tariff measures. So that's the conditions that they had to follow. Now, in developed countries, there are greater prospects of expanding sustainable consumption, either due to the environmental awareness that also Kai mentioned earlier, or stricter environmental regulations related to the NDCs, the National Determinant Contribution. And of course, the zero emissions targets in the Paris Agreement. In low and middle income countries, the biggest barriers are higher costs and a lack of legal requirements and policies on sustainability issues. So to give some idea also of the size of what we're talking about, in the ITC standards map, the number of voluntarily sustainability standards have continued to grow. Currently, there are around 321 active worldwide and about 455 eco-labels. Again, depending on the eco-label index that it shows in that map. Okay. In 199 countries and 25 industry sectors. And then I would just like to bring this discussion more again into the multilateral. So we look at the WTO negotiations, we can see that in the past, the concentration or the focus of the whole negotiations was on agricultural subsidies as distortion to trade. And that was the biggest discussion from the AOA and everything. But what's going on today is now we have to add an environmental dimension to these negotiations. Again, Kai mentioned it, it is what we are dealing with today. So agricultural subsidies now are seen as a distortion to trade, but also disruptive elements to the element. And there are many ways of how you want to, how you define and what are the main objectives or problems that everybody sees when they talked about agricultural subsidies and negotiations. So I think that one of the important things that we need to start thinking about is how we can realign these trade policies and disciplines to support the environmental sustainability agenda. And there are 3 things that it comes to my mind. One is the issue of the carbon border adjustment measure, that we need to make sure that it is under a sustainability standard and or a carbon tax, but that's something to be discussed. But the most important thing for me is that we really need to have a benchmark or put it into the framework of a Codex Alimentarius, for example, or building on because what we need to do is to make sure this is not used or abused in the disputes. The second one is the climate smart agricultural, that it has to be compatible with Article 2 of the Agreement of Agriculture. The most important one is the green box, to avoid the greenwashing, what it is called, so that we have clear definitions and clear measurements of what we're talking about. And then, of course, the environmental performance of the Article 6.2, which could be questionable or not, but it's something also to be discussed. And then, of course, the issue of insurance, in which box we need to include it and how it is designed and implemented. And then the last one, and it's following what Kai just mentioned, is promoting innovation and R&D. However, I would like to add that this innovation have to be shared. So it's there's a need for a global public good. More than anything, we're talking about environmental issues. So if we're talking about emissions, emissions will not only affect you, but it will affect your neighbor, and it will affect even a country on the other side of the planet. And then the intellectual property rights, the framework, that it needs to include the dimension or concept of food security and climate adaptation. And then just to finalize, I think that what we've been saying today is that international trade allows for a better use of scarce resources. International trade as well is part of the adaptation strategy. International trade may contribute to mitigation efforts. And climate-smart agricultural policy will require proper disciplines to make sure that they are not abused and they are really well designed. And so I've been thinking about all these things, but I heard the other day Pascal Lamy in a meeting, and he came up with this question that I think that I would like to finish my presentation with a question so that we can start thinking about this. So, you know, we have food security, we have the environment, we have trade, we have also the nutritious, healthy diets. But what does adding the aspect of geopolitical resilience change? And I think that that's something new that it comes to us this year, that it's on top of what things that we've been thinking about in previous years. And I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. That was very thought-provoking, especially your final note. So thank you both to Valeria and Kai for getting us off to such a good and challenging start. Actually, I think both your presentations are quite challenging in terms of what needs to be done, what further steps need to be taken. So I'm going to probe both of you and push you a little bit more on that, on some of the things you have mentioned, but I would just like to remind the audience to please put any of their thoughts, comments, and questions on the Q&A using the Q&A function. So I'll start off, I'll pick up you, Valeria, you talked at the very end about intellectual property rights, and Kai also mentioned that. So I'm going to pick up on that issue. Now, obviously, we have intellectual property rights regime through the WTO, also through trade agreements, and it is not free from controversy. So obviously, particularly in the area of medicines, for example, there have been cases of perhaps certain abuses, certain structures of power and power imbalances that arise out of intellectual property and copyrights. It's also fed into some of the discussions and concerns around genetically modified food and organisms, for example, and GMO seeds, and having to constantly pay the particular companies for certain seeds and using certain products. So I just wanted to ask both of you, Valeria, you talk about requiring an intellectual property rights framework that takes account of food security and also climate adaptation. So my question to you is, whilst I can see how that could work very well in terms of incentivizing innovation from the private sector to come up with solutions to these problems, how can we ensure that we don't end up in a situation of certain monopolies or replicating some of these power imbalances and hierarchies that we have seen maybe in the area of medicines? And I think the same question applies also to Kai and the points he raised again around private property rights. So it's whose rights are we talking about? I can see the value of this as a way of incentivizing innovation, but how can we prevent abuses and prevent power imbalances?
Well, I can start. I mean, I specifically talked about like private property rights in general, less so IP, although I think the same arguments would on some level apply. I think it's essential that we secure private property rights specifically from the incentive standpoint. Why would anyone try to bring up any innovations if they cannot actually kind of reap the rewards of it? I think if you put it on sort of the public level, that would disincentivize innovation in a very general way. So that's also, I mean, it was a great presentation by Valeria, but I think one of the things that I was wondering about is when you mentioned public, that innovation has to be shared as a public good, which I would consider at first to be a very dangerous endeavor, because I think it would it would basically lead to no one actually wanting to innovate anything, if I understood it correctly. But maybe you could go a little bit more into that, because I would be curious myself what that actually means in the end. But I think I wouldn't be, and I think we need to again kind of think: are we talking about a market approach or a crony approach? You mentioned medicine. I could not really think of any area that is more crony than that sector. It's a business in which governments and medical companies work together on that, and that's, I think, in many ways why you would have that monopolization in that area. I would be much more optimistic if you actually can get governments out of the market proceedings or the market process, that these monopolies would still be created and still be sustainable in the end. And that's one of the things that when my friend and I were working on this book, Green Market Revolution, one of the things I wrote a chapter on environmental entrepreneurship. And I was kind of, before I started writing the chapter, I was like, okay, I'm not sure if I can actually find really good examples of environmental entrepreneurship. It was kind of a theoretical concept that I wasn't sure if it actually existed already in the world. But then, you go into it, and I could not stop finding more examples. There were like thousands upon thousands of different examples. And I think it's much more important to see that upside of having secure private property rights, what that can actually bring about, because all of these innovations, all of these entrepreneurial endeavors can only happen if there is secure private property rights, which is currently prevented in so many different ways. It would be prevented by basically destroying the private property structure. And in that sense, I think let's not just focus sort of on the negative, the potential dangers, which I think usually arise from crony approaches, not market approaches, and to focus on the upside of, if we have private property rights that are secure, we would see massive opportunities when it comes to both the environment and the economy, by enabling these enviropreneurs, these environmental entrepreneurs, to actually, create different innovations and to try things out. And I think that can only happen with private property rights. And so it's essential to have that as kind of the basis of it all. And then I think, again, the monopolization usually happens when like big corporations then try to capture regulatory processes and get a raw deal from the government.
Thank you, Kai. Valeria, if you'd like to also respond to Kai's question in there as well. Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would like to start by saying that I am not a lawyer, so all the specificities of this I will not deal with. But I would like to make the point that we cannot generalize. So I think that this question should be taken into consideration under many different scenarios or many different ways of looking at the issue. So one thing is, when we talked about innovation has many steps. So yes, we need to have the new technology or the new research and create this new thing that it is out there. But then we need to create the right incentives so that the producers or whoever will adopt these new technologies. Otherwise, we're not getting anywhere. And then right after there is an adoption, then we see the impact of this new, again, technology, seed, or whatever we're talking about, into the benefit for society if doing that. So when we talked about the agricultural sector, which I think is a little bit different than other sectors, for the fact that, first of all, everybody has to eat, otherwise, so it's almost, some people say that it's a right. I don't know, I'm not going to get into there, but everybody needs to eat. So it is a different kind of product or something that we talked about. And then again, if we're talking about food security and environmental sustainability, we have to look at developed countries, developing countries, and low-income countries. So there's a big differentiation as well in what it is important for each of these groups. Important not only for the citizens of that country, but also what they can get and contribute to the world. Again, we're talking about food security, global food security, and global environmental sustainability. So that's one thing. The other differentiation that we need to make sure that we consider is what kind of commodity are we talking about? Are we talking about a big traded commodity like it is soybeans, wheat, maize? Are we talking about fruits and vegetables? Are we talking about just food crops in terms of, I don't know, coffee, that is important for the country just for exports, but it's a different kind of product? And then what's the size of this producer? So what are we talking about? Are we talking a big producer that can have access to credit, that has access to the new technologies, that they can handle the world differently? Or are we talking about the small holder in which we still need help? So my comments were kind of maybe touching more into the developing world and into the small farmer, in the way that if, for example, we looked at livestock, the livestock sector. If we look at livestock sector, one thing is to consider the producer, for example, in Canada, that it has more feedlots, and it's one kind of technology. Another thing is also a very competitive livestock producer, which could be Argentina, but it has pastures. So those two are different ways of producing. There are different ways of how they impact the environment, but they are both bigger in scale, if you want to say. But if we look at, like, for example, livestock in some countries in Africa, they use it for their own consumption. It's the only source of proteins that they have. And the way they have that cow is very inefficient if we looked in terms of amount of emissions per unit of product. So that small producer, they need help in what? Making it more sustainable in the way that maybe finding the new technologies that will help that. Agroforestry, for example, is becoming one big thing that it's telling that it can help in terms of producing more efficiently, again, in terms of emissions. So that there are many things that they are already out there, that agroforestry is not really a patent, it's just a way of producing, that it could be definitely used in other countries that hasn't been used till now, just for lack of resources, lack of extension services, and so forth. So that there are many things that we can start doing that will definitely help in contributing to this global objective that we have in terms of trying to eliminate global food insecurity and help the global environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. So just picking up on that and on Kai's question about how to share innovation as a public good without eliminating the incentive for companies to innovate and reap the benefits of that is what you were talking. So some of what you were talking about here towards the end sounds a little bit like that. But can you say a little bit more about how you would envisage that spread of innovation as a public good and that more collaborative approach, and how would that be organized? Who would be organizing that? Where do we need to find the agency and the support for that?
So I think that in that sense, there are many institutions that are already there. There's nothing that we need to create. So for example, I work for IFPRI, that is one of the centers from the CGIAR. The CGIAR, it's that's what they do. They have many different centers. One, I don't know, you have the SIP, CIMIT, SIAD. They all work in different commodities. ILRI has the livestock in Kenya. So that there are many public, global, international institutions that work on that without having anything. So, and they do a lot of extension programs, they do a lot of technical cooperation, etc. In the Americas also, well, you have also, of course, FAO, and you have IICA in America, etc. But then you have all the local INEAs, all the local institutions that that also that do innovation, but also work very closely with producers in trying to do that kind of step forward so that they do the adoption of these technologies. Of course, that this requires money. So some of the developing countries, they don't have the amount and they don't invest as much in these areas just because they don't have that capacity. So that could be one way also looking at it. And of course that now we have all these global funds that cares about mitigation and more than anything adaptation strategies, so that there is now a pool of money that it comes from different funds. No, one is the GASP, for example, that they just had a new call for proposals, so that they are going to be looking at them right now. And for example, that's a very nice way of looking at specific projects around the world, in which it could be adaptation strategy to fix something in particular. It could be the coffee, it could be livestock. So it has a lot of different commodities, and there are specific projects and that they could be funded that way. So I guess that it really depends exactly, Maria, what specific, again, context matters a lot. So I do not want to make some general statement, because it really depends a lot in, again, what kind of commodity, what the size of research, what kind of country you are, so that there are many different things. But the tools are there, the institutions are there. It's just a matter of reorganizing, or maybe giving more support to the institutions that maybe they don't have enough resources or connections. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Valeria. And we're moving into the final 10 minutes of our session today. So I'd just like to remind our audience that if they have any comments or questions, they can put them in the Q&A, and I will read them out so that Valeria and Kai can address them as well. Whilst you think of questions, I've got lots. I can continue this going on for this for days, but I won't. So I'd like to bring us in these final minutes a little bit to think a little bit more about the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. I think your presentations have been fantastic in giving us a broader understanding of alternatives, and also of what is already happening in terms of making food production and food trade more sustainable, where markets can contribute in tracing a future where we can use trade in a beneficial way, and as Kai was saying, going away from this kind of crony market capitalism to a more, dare I say, purer version of a more balanced variety of capitalism and of market structures. Trade agreements, including the one between the EU and Mercosur, they are negotiated by states, so there's a lot of government intervention in there, but they are meant to be tools to facilitate trade, to promote more free trade, and to promote a market-based approach, really, to production and trade. So my question, what I'd be interested is in hearing your thoughts on whether you think that they are playing that role in facilitating these more market-based visions of greener trade, and in particular whether the EU-Mercosur agreement does that, or whether there are still elements that can be improved in order for trade agreements to become tools that facilitate green trade in a better way.
So I would just to preface, I'm not a trade policy expert, so take that with a grain of salt. But I would say that while those free trade agreements are beneficial, generally speaking, when it comes to the environment, a lot more could be done in kind of the vein that I was kind of talking about and thinking about. Let's say it's very small, but kind of the way that ACCTS has tried to do it. And so I don't want to jump again and again on the whole crony approach thing, but it is kind of fitting in the sense that when you look at like negotiations, also just different opinions on EU Latin American trade agreements, it seems like that crony approach often seems to win out, both in the people that advocate for it as well as those who oppose it. And I think it would be a great time if you have one of these trade agreements to kind of get rid of a lot of these things. And so if you look at the free aspects that I talked about, eco-labeling, and then, but especially I think the first 2 points are the most essential, which is getting rid of market distortions and reducing / eliminating trade barriers. I'm sure in the latter part, the trade agreements do a great job, but I think just basically putting a greater emphasis on the environment in and of itself and setting better incentives would be good. And then at the same time, the market distortions is something that generally seems to not be as greatly a part of all of these things. And so, I mean, that would be a good, one of the things that I always reminded of on the EU level, when we talk about crony approach and when we talk about the government approach sort of actually damaging the environment, there's no policy that I can think of that does that better than the common agricultural policy, which, I mean, the New York Times had this report 2 or 3 years ago, I think, where they basically proved that where the most agricultural subsidies go, surprise, surprise, there's the most pollution, there's the most nitrate pollution, there's the most waterway pollution, all of these things across the continent. So if you're actually environmentally conscious, or if you actually want to be environmentally conscious, that might be something to look into. And I think a free trade agreement would be a good way of kind of creating a balanced approach, a more level playing field of, you know, it's maybe not the best approach to just spend astronomical amounts of money on protecting certain industries, such as agriculture or fossil fuel. And you obviously have to do it in a wise way to kind of reduce that impact. But I think a trade agreement and trade agreements across the globe would be a great opportunity to kind of get rid of these things and to say, if we actually want to prevent the environment, then stuff like the common agricultural policy, stuff like the fossil fuel subsidies and all these things cannot continue in the way they have been. And to make great changes in that. And obviously those are then separate discussions also from the free trade agreement, but it could be an opportunity to just think of those things a little more.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kai. And it's very interesting. I mean, the discussion on common, we'd need many more sessions to really go into common agricultural policy, but it's interesting. So if we look at the world, at the WTO and even GATT before that, and the debates there, even without taking account of environment, there has always been a lot of pressure from other countries, especially from developing countries, against the subsidies and the distortions created by the cap. And of course, these aren't really addressed in any substantial way in trade agreements, or even the agreement with Mercosur, which, although it allows a little bit more agricultural exports to the EU, it's still quite constrained. So we've got very few minutes remaining. So I'm just going to finish off by reading out a couple of questions that have just come in through the Q&A, so that our speakers can have a go at answering them. So one of the questions I think is for Valeria, and it's specifically, where can one find allies for the types of actions you were talking about against climate change? Is there some database to identify some of those groups you were referring to earlier on? And the other question, which is more generic, sorry, they've written them in Spanish, I'm just translating in my head. So the final one, which ties in, I guess, to COP27, is more a comment, a broader comment about how trade agreements are very slow, especially, negotiations can be quite slow, especially when you take into account some of the climate change commitments that have already been made through Agenda 2030 and the timelines that should be taken into account for those. So this member of the audience is suggesting we need to work more quickly. How can we speed up negotiations at the state level, state to state level? So is there a database, or where can we find those allies for actions against climate change? And how can we get states to negotiate bilaterally at a faster pace?
Thank you,
Valeria?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, and the people that put their question. So database, I'm sure there is. I just can't come on some to my mind, but I can definitely send you some links of CGIAR and of the institutions that there are particular institutions that I did mention. I would just like to, I guess that we have 1 minute, so I would just use it to just follow up a little bit what Kai was mentioning. So I think that at this point, and it could be also a way of moving the agenda forward, is to talk about repurposing of the agricultural subsidies or domestic support. So this word of repurposing can mean many different things, but the way I'm using it, which again, it depends on where you are, how people interpret it. If you're at the WTO, they looked at it with kind of suspicious, thinking that it's just going to be a greenwashing of allowing everybody to keep using the subsidies that they have, and just now that they are allowed and they don't have to reuse them. And also, but the biggest idea is repurposing, and we've been doing a lot of work at IFPRI on this, so there are many reports that I could also share, but it's to start introducing the idea, the concept, the discussion. And when we mean repurposing, what it means is, okay, we have $6 billion of domestic support, fine. If our objective is environmental sustainability, how we can use that amount of money to get the best returns, again, considering in terms of environmental. And so the discussion then it becomes between, okay, do we keep that money in between boundaries of each country? Or if we're really thinking of a global objective, would it make sense to use that money and give it to the South, developing countries, the countries that really need that money in order to adopt the new technologies and make more efficient production in terms of emissions and so forth. So that is another way of looking at it, but we can have a whole seminar on the topic. So I just wanted to highlight the idea, but nothing further. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the ELF for organizing this and getting us together. Thank you very much to Kai and Valeria for your very thought-provoking comments. Thank you to the audience for staying on with us. I'd like to remind the audience that there is a final session on the 1st of December on where is the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement going and why does it matter. So I hope you'll be able to join us and the speakers on that day again for this. And thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon or rest of the morning or day wherever you are. Thank you also to Sandra and Marcela for their interpretation work today. So thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.